Hello, everyone. I'm Camille Baker. I'm a board member of CAS Society since around this time last year, I believe. And I am a media artist, curator, and professor of interactive and immersive arts in the School of Communication and senior tutor for digital direction at the Royal College of Art, also only since about this time last year. And I will be your chair tonight, as Sean mentioned, for our guest speaker, Jim Andrews. And just a little anecdote, I think I put my hand up when Jim's name came up because I said, oh, I know Jim, I've been following him for a while. So I met Jim in around I had to check the dates actually, around 2000, 2001, when I was probably one of my very first roles in anything new media. I was on the board for the Edgewise Electrolytic Center in Vancouver, which is a poetry and multimedia society. And it was already dealing with different kinds of net art and online innovative poetry. And at that point, I'd already been sort of following what was going on the internet in terms of net art. I was very excited about all the things that were going on. And I'd noticed that Jim was very innovative in the net art space, especially around poetry and different kinds of visualizations. At the time, the internet was a very exciting place. Just before what they called the dot-com bomb, when a lot of the arts initiatives sort of vanished. And it's great based on all the things he sent through recently to see he's still working in somewhat the same kind of practice. And I hope he'll cover a little bit of his journey from then until now. Otherwise, I'll have to have another conversation with him at another date. And I'll just read some of what he sent over in terms of his bio, and then I'll pass the reins over to Jim himself, and he can take it from there. So Jim Andrews finished his degree in English and mathematics in Canada at the University of Victoria in 1983. He then hosted and produced a literary radio show at CFUV, that sounds like University of Victoria, FM for 6 years, and he then distributed that on cassette to up to 15 other campus stations in Canada, where he was introduced to using technology in art. He eventually encountered the work of the so-called audio writers, artists such as Gregory Whitehead, Douglas Kahn, Helen Thorington, who made recorded sound and radio into artistic media for their work as writers. As well as reading Marshall McLuhan, Baudrillard, Burroughs, etc., he came to understand the importance of understanding one's own media or medium, of taking advantage of the special properties of one's medium. In 1990, he went back to school and studied math or computer science, but it wasn't until he took a course called Language and the Theory of Computation that he began to understand the significance of computing to art. Back then in Victoria, there was very little comprehension of the artistic possibilities of computers. I would argue still in some circles. But it wasn't until the web that he fell in love with computers as a medium for art. He started his website bizpo.com in 1996 and has since then built one of the main sites by individual artists for multimedia, programmed web art or net art, which continues to be the center of his work as an artist programmer, as a poet, as a theoretician, and international communicator about computer art. His work has been written about extensively by scholars of electronic literature, and he sees himself as a writer, visual artist, audio artist, and programmer. Over to you, Jim.
Well, thanks very much, Camille. I think you went to Tech BC, right?
I did.
Right. We met when I gave a talk at Tech BC. I remember you were at that talk. Actually.
I think we met earlier, but I was there too.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks to Paul Brown, everybody in the Computer Art Society. I've long considered what I do as computer art. There's an interesting book by UBC, University of British Columbia, philosopher by the name of Dominic Lopez. He wrote a book called A Philosophy of Computer Art. which is the first book that I've seen by a professional philosopher on, a philosophy of computer art. It's very interesting. I interviewed him about it, but net art is part of what I do. Some sort of weird poetry is what I do. Visual art, it's one of the things that I've tried to learn about for, well, since 1996. I have no training in visual art, but no formal training, but it's been one of my passions to learn about. But computer art is an important term to me, and I think that's definitely a big part of what I do. So it's great to be here, Computer Art Society, talking with you. So many thanks. So the talk is going to be mainly about something that I've been working on since 2011. Excuse me, called Aleph Null, which is a graphic synthesizer and an instrument of color music. What do I mean by a graphic synthesizer and an instrument of color music? Well, the term color music has some history. It goes back several hundred years, actually. It doesn't necessarily involve any audio whatsoever. It's a term that involves visuals. So you produce visuals that are like music, in the sense that music proceeds through time with sonic tones, and color music proceeds through time with colors and shapes and forms. So Aleph Null is an instrument of color music. It's something that you can play with the keyboard. And also it's a graphic synthesizer. Version 1 was not a graphic synthesizer. It was solely an instrument of color music. But version 2 and version 3 introduced the ability to process bitmaps. And so you create brushes. The fundamental idea of Aleph Null is kind of a painterly metaphor. You create brushes, and each brush you feed, if it's a graphic synthesizer, sort of a brush, you feed it a folder of images, and it samples from those images and draws or writes, paints at least one time per frame on the screen. So it proceeds by these brush strokes, we'll call them. Whether it's a graphic synthesizer, sort of a brush, or a color music sort of brush. So anyway, let me see if I can share my screen. I'm going to show you a lot of images in this talk. Share screen. Okay. So I presume that you are seeing an Aleph Null screen at the moment, correct? Yeah. Okay, so this is the first screen that you see with Aleph Null 1.0, and when I click that, it enters it. It was funded by a grant from the Canada Council, a senior arts grant from the Canada Council. It's kind of a funny story about that, as probably there are about many grants, many arts grants. So my friend Kedrick James, who's a poet, visual artist, scholar here in Vancouver, he said, "I'm going to be on this jury. You should apply." It was a literary jury, actually, concerning storytelling. So I applied, and I said that what I was going to do was I was going to take DB Cinema, which was an earlier graphic synthesizer that I created, on the road as a poetry performance tool. And so I talked about that in this proposal. Well, by the time that the proposals started being, by the time I found out that I'd actually got the grant, director had become pretty much obsolete. And it was, you know, it was a terrible idea to proceed doing anything with director at that point. And so I thought, well, what am I going to do here? This is an opportunity to go forward in time with projects, not, you know, lock myself into doing something that really has no future. So I retooled in a very big way with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, because what was the alternative to director at that point? Well, it was the HTML5 canvas. So, which does not require any plugins. So I retooled in a big way, and that's what Aleph Null is in all its versions. It's an HTML5 canvas, and so it's kind of like a drawing with math, of course. The curves are Bezier curves, and quadratic equations, and whatnot. So what we're looking at now is the first version of Aleph Null, and this is simply an instrument of color music. And so let me see, change the opacity, bring the opacity up. And you've got this fader that fades the screen out. Well, it's not doing much fading the screen out. You've got a FPS, frames per second, slider that changes the speed of the thing, changes the size of the polygons. So there's all sorts of different controls that you can use. And it's got pretty good keyboard control as well. Also, I should say that I put together a PDF for this talk, and let me post a link to that PDF in the chat so that you can. There we go. There's the PDF for the talk. That's going to be a guide to what I'm doing. So if you've got a couple of screens going on, you can download that and open it up and follow with that. I've got 3 screens going on here in my setup, and probably a lot of you have multiple screens as well. And Paul Catney's, thanks for coming. I read your book on director many years ago. It's a great book. And thanks everybody else for coming. I see the pictures right now. So that's version 1 of Aleph Null, and it's preceded by something that I created called DB Cinema, which let me see. Yeah. So are you? I guess I need to share my screen again. Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing DB Cinema now, are you? Okay. So I'll show you the sorts of images that I created with DB Cinema. Let me see what's a good one to pick here. Well, these ones are fairly simple. Yeah. So these are sort of color music images again. There's no bitmap processing going on in these images. And show you some of the Kandinsky-based ones. Yeah. Change the options here. So you can see that this looks like Kandinsky paintings in a way. And it's sampling from them. These are screenshots. We're not looking at Aleph Null in process. We're looking at screenshots of actually DB Cinema in process. And so I quite like these, although, you know, in retrospect, maybe they're a little too Kandinsky-ish, right? When people see them, they think, Kandinsky, rather than, oh, that's really something new. So, whereas, you know, with the Aleph Null stuff, it's a little more original. And there are currently 4 versions of Aleph Null online. What's the basic architecture of 1.0 of Aleph Null? Well, you've got one brush only on screen with different configurable nibs that draws successive brush strokes. And this painterly metaphor runs through all versions of Aleph Null. And I showed Aleph Null 1.0 in Paris at the Sorbonne at a conference on innovative writing called And Now in 2012, where 3 digital literary scholars, Leonardo Flores, Giovanna de Rosario, and Mark Marino, presented papers on Aleph Null. Back then, my work was fairly prominent in electronic literature. A lot of it was more recognizably electronic literature-ish. But since then, it's become more visual, although there are still literary dimensions to it. And so I've kind of, the electronic literature people find, is he really doing electronic literature? So currently my work exists in a kind of no man's land between visual art and literary stuff. There's a lot of audio stuff going on as well. So it's very much about mixing media and arts with computers. But here's version 2 of the connection to VisPo is not secure. Now I'm going to continue to cite. There we go. So this is the front page to Aleph Null 2.0. And I'll show you a slideshow of some of the stuff that I created with 2.0. So you see that the images are a little more granular than the first version. And so these are the sort of color music images that can be created with Aleph Null 2.0, but it also introduced bitmap processing. So there was one that used bitmap, but let me show you some of the sort of bitmap processing that it did. There's one, there's another, this was around the time that David Bowie passed away. So a lot of the work that I did with Aleph Null 2.0 in visual, in graphics, in bitmap processing is oriented towards images of David Bowie mixed together from different periods of his life. But anyway, so here's some of the sorts of images that can be created with 2.0, which some of the features that it had, you can create, destroy, edit multiple brushes rather than having just one brush. You can have multiple brushes. Some nibs work with text, which can be filled with color or bitmaps. And it behaves on mobile devices with touch interfaces, which version 1.0 did not. So yeah, version 2.0, that was around 2017. Version 1 was 2011. Version 2 was 2017. And then came version 3, which I'll go to now. And let me show some images from that. Actually, I'll show you one of the videos that I created with it. This is in collaboration with a poet by the name of Adina Karasik. She was raised in Vancouver, but she's been teaching in New York City for some time at the Pratt Institute. And so this has got two brushes. The foreground brush is a text brush, and the background is the stuff that you see in the background. But we produce a lot of video poems together. So she gave me her poem called Checking In. She's got a book called Checking In. And so I produced it. And then she picked out 250 images that are relevant to the text. And so then I produced this video poem, which I suppose in terms of computer art, looks a bit like Young Hei Chang. Young Hei Chang does big text, but it's usually with music. If you know Young Hei Chang's work. But anyway, so that's one of the things from version 3. Let me show you some other stuff from version 3. This is from a collaboration with the legendary Canadian poet Bill Bissett. Now, Bill Bissett has been at it since the 60s. He's actually since the 50s. He's in his 80s right now, and he's still at it. And so he lived in Vancouver during the 60s a lot, although he goes back and forth between Toronto and Vancouver. But I've known him since I did my radio show back in the 80s. He was on my radio show several times. And he's been kind of a big deal since Jack Kerouac, the famous beat poet, described him as one of the greatest living poets in the Paris Review back in the 60s. So he does an interesting sort of visual poetry. And so I was in touch with him. I said, well, actually, he was in touch with me. He said, why don't you give me some stuff for a visual poetry show that I'm putting together in Toronto? And I said, well, love to. Why don't you send me some of your visual poetry and I'll feed it to my synthesizer, my graphic synthesizer, and then I can send you some of that stuff from the show in Toronto. I said, love to. So he sent me some images, and the results that I was getting were so good. And the images that he was sending me were relatively recent ones that he put together with his computer. That I thought, well, I'm going to visit the SFU Special Collections Library, where they have the best collection on earth of Bill Bissett's work, because he was king of the hippies here in Vancouver during the 60s. And so I talked to them about my visit before I went there, and they said, well, give us an indication of what you'd like to see. So I sent them a PDF of the stuff that I wanted to see. When I got there, they had like 6 horizontal feet of Bill Bissett's work for me to check out. And so I spent the whole day going through his work and photographing it. They had a great camera that I could use to photograph it as well. Wonderful art experience all day going through this material. And so, I then prepped these images. And what I mean by prepped the images, I removed the background and haloed the text. So you can see that the text is largely haloed in the sense that there's you can see some sort of background around the text, so that it stands out a bit more. It's a little bit more readable, because of course one of the problems that exists in this sort of work, where you have these brushes that are essentially destroying images, in this sort of obliterature, as it's been called, is often what you get is just a mess. Often what you get is just a washed out mess of indistinct, who knows what. So there has to be some sort of strategy for rescuing it from that to obliteration, to the creation of signal, the creation and preservation in some sense of signal. So that's part of the poetics, I think, this sort of work is poetics of signal noise, of creating some sort of signal, not just mushing it into nothingness, but creating some sort of alternative signal. And so part of that is prepping of the images so that, they're more distinct, they're transparent, they're PNGs, so they have transparent parts, and they layer nicely. So these images, they have there's I guess in these there's a couple of brushes going on. There's one brush that is putting down polygons, and then there's another brush that is I call it a tangent brush, that I'll show you shortly. That is sort of overwriting those. But Bill was really happy with this, which made me happy. So that's some of the work from 3.0, but also 3.0 is it involves work of 19 invited artists. Bill Bissett was one of them. Let me show you 3.0 itself. The actual, what we were looking at there were screenshots, but let me show you the piece itself, original 3.0. So this is the thing itself, and if we see up here, these are what I call nib icons. So when you click on, say, Bill Bissett's image, then we start seeing the Bill Bissett brush in action. And what's happening is it's downloading about 500 megabytes. It's currently downloading about 500 megabytes of Bill Bissett's graphics. So these are fairly high resolution graphics as well. And if I click, say, this one, then what we're seeing is the Jim Leftwich brush. Jim Leftwich is a visual poet in the USA. He really he's the I guess you could say the originator, along with some of his friends, of the term asemic writing. And his work is quite interesting in its visual aspect. I would say he's more of a visual artist than a lot of visual poets that I encounter. Because, you know, a lot of the visual poets that I encounter, the visual dimension of them is literary. It's more about the way that the words are beside one another, position of the words and the letters. It's got more of a literary dimension than much of a visual dimension in terms of visual art. But Jim Leftwich, his work is, when people look at his work, visual artists will say, oh, that's familiar to me from blah, blah, blah. So that's some of Jim Leftwich's work. Let me see. Here's some work by Maria Damon. Maria Damon is an interesting New York poet who does a lot of stuff with fabric. She does a lot of visual poetry with fabric. And so we're remixing some of her stuff. So we're seeing one brush here, but if I click the create button, then now we're seeing two brushes. We're seeing Bill Bissett's work on top of Maria's work. Actually, whose is on top? Well, the way that I can tell is I look at the fader. So layer 2 is Bill Bissett. So if I put Maria as layer 1, then what do we get? Actually, Maria's has got to be the top right now. Where's these down and up buttons? Let me adjust the different layers. And the fundamental architecture of Aleph Null 3.0 is that you have multiple brushes on multiple canvases, and the canvases are one on top of another. And you can have multiple brushes on one canvas, or you can put the brushes on different canvases, and then you can arrange which is on top with these down and up buttons. But anyway, that's one of the improvements in version 3 is this new architecture of layers. There's a new control panel, and you can set the pixel dimensions of Aleph Null so that you can, although my screen is currently 1920 by 1080, you can set it to whatever you like in terms of the pixel size of the images, the screenshots that you can produce, so that when I had a show of works from Aleph Null in 2019, I put $5,000 into printing the images, and had a show at a place in Vancouver called Massey Books. And so the images there were very high res thousands and thousands of images printed out. So it's relatively easy to do, actually, for these web things. You think, oh, web things, it's going to be low res. But it's very easy with JavaScript to produce images that are as high res as you like. These images are a little more nasty, of course. They're mashups of Donald Trump along with his co-creatures. These were from 2018 piece that I did called The Moral Deformity of Team Trump. So these are mashing up Trump with his cabinet, some of his advisors, and a few other Republicans. And so this friend of mine said, gee, I really like those. I'll give you $1,000 to make a video of this. And so he got the permission of 9 Inch Nails to use a song of theirs called Head Like a Hole. So I'll go to that, show you a bit of that. Head Like a Hole. There we go. I'll spare you the audio, but we're not interested in the audio in this talk. We're interested in the visuals. I don't think you can hear the audio, right? Yeah. Okay, you can't hear the audio. So I can hear the audio. I'm gonna turn the audio off. So yes, Head Like a Hole by 9 Inch Nails. It's playing, and these are screenshots of a project that I did called a later project that I did called American Hitler, which is such that you can actually now sort of see better who's being mixed. These images you can say, oh, that's this person and that person, more than with the previous images. So this is a kind of a graphic synthesis as well, obviously. These are putting together images in a way that isn't like morphs. Morphs are more like you map the nose to the nose, and you map the eye to the eye, and the ear to the ear. This is a different kind of a mapping. This is more. Well, there is some deformity involved here, but it's hopefully it's more a kind of getting at the moral deformity that's involved rather than a physical deformity, because nobody wants to make fun of people because of physical deformities. It's a different sort of deformity that's going on here in terms of these characters. So there's some of those sorts of images that I created with version 3. Let me show you some other images. This is from something that I call City on the Other Side of Time. And so these images that are being synthesized are they're from the 9th to the 18th century primarily, and they're publicly licensed images that have to do with alchemy and or cosmology. And so there's also images from all over the world that are kind of magical images. But the idea of this one is the city on the other side of time. A lot of the images they remind you of some sort of place. Although in that text that came up first, it also says some of the books. You see images of some of the books from this city on the other side of time. And so these are a lot more, these have a totally different tone, of course, than the Trump images. And there's a different sort of a synthesis going on amongst these images. And show you some other images. This is a collaboration with a Russian poet by the name of Kirill Azerny. He gave me some texts of his, and so I synthesized these with Aleph Null 3.0, actually with 3.1, and so these are a different approach to. Well, it's a story. He gave me a story of his, and a different approach to fiction. And then show you some images of another collaboration with with a Toronto visual poet by the name of Daniel F. Bradley. And so his work is, he did these with Letraset. And so he had this bunch of Letraset left from, I don't know, the 70s, something like that. And he created these visual poems. See, we're not getting subsequent images here. There we go. Okay. So he put these images together, and I thought, wow, I bet those would synthesize really well with Aleph Null. And I think they kind of did. So that's some of that stuff. Then these are images in a project that I call Time Machine. Let me see, slideshow. Yeah. So you see these are synthesizing images of clocks and other time devices with sometimes some text. I made these in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So that's the 2021, 22 text that you see going on. Here's some other images that I did in a project called No New Ideas. Slideshow one. Yeah, so this is an experimental comic. A friend of mine was putting together a project where he said, here's a page from my abstract comic. Here's a page from my abstract comic. Do something with it and send me the results, and I'll post the results. So he got all sorts of interesting people responding to his abstract comic. And so I said, okay, well, how about I take all of those results, your abstract comic, their results, and feed it to Aleph Null and see what we get. And so these are screenshots of that process. Now, of course, as with most of the stuff that we've looked at, we're looking at screenshots. We're looking at carefully curated selections of the process. But let me show you what it looks like in Aleph Null itself. Yeah. 3.1. So it looks a bit different in Aleph Null 3.1. Of course, it's downloading the graphics. So it starts out not having many graphics to work with. In fact, given our situation in this talk where lots of my bandwidth is allocated to other things than Aleph Null, it's not going to be downloading the graphics very quickly. And in fact, we can see that it's oh yeah, well now it has 2 graphics to synthesize. So you can see that the experience of Aleph Null itself is different than the experience of the curated screenshots. But that's one of the things that that I do is there's Aleph Null itself, there's the curated screenshots of it, and then there's also videos of it, so that there's different types of experiences of Aleph Null from this experience, which is sort of in a continual state of becoming, to the screenshots, which are always there, right? They're curated, and each shot is there. And then there's the videos, which often are sort of between the two. So, and then there's, of course, the prints that I make, which are something else. The prints are typically anywhere from like 3 feet by 2 feet to like 2 feet by 1 feet sort of thing. And they're different. I had some people over who were looking at them recently, and they said, we prefer these to the computer screens of them. I said, why on earth would you say that? They said, well, because these aren't changing so quickly. We can contemplate these and read them in a way that is more familiar to us in what we do. So, okay. Myself, I like screens, but I like screens and computer art. But anyway, so that's the project. No New Ideas, and let me see what else can I show you here in Aleph Null land. Well, here's a in Aleph Null 4, which isn't out yet. There's going to be a bunch of front doors to all sorts of different projects. This is the front door to the color music stuff. And so there's an essay on color music, what it is. And color music has a history, it has its origins in the theory, prevalent in the Renaissance, and systematically set forth by the 17th century Jesuit music theorist and mathematician Athanasius Kircher, 1602-1680, that each musical sound has a necessary objective correspondence to a certain color. From the 18th to the 20th century, experiments were made by adapting various keyboard instruments in such a way that when a key was depressed, it would, in addition to producing a sound, raise a colored tape or glass through which light was projected on a screen. Several modern composers, notably Arnold Schoenberg and Alexander Scriabin, were attracted by the idea and produced examples of color music. So yes, the idea of color music has some history. And there's an essay on it. And all these front doors will have writing about the project. And then we have all sorts of links. Here's the Aleph Null tangent. When I click that, it opens Aleph Null itself. You're seeing Aleph Null itself now, right? Okay. Yes, so here is the Aleph Null tangent nib. And I can tell that the tangent nib is working because it is selected here. If I click this, it opens another version of the tangent nib. Click it again, we have that one. This is kind of the funnest thing to do in Aleph Null, is to click these different nibs and see what you get. Here's like the text brush, text image. Here's another text brush. The story of my life is told like this. Oh my God, what a boring life. But the story of my life is told like this. This is the alchemical cosmography brush. The frames per second is too high. We bring it down. And like I say, in a different situation where there's more bandwidth, this would be displaying all sorts of different stuff. Well, and actually, it's not doing too bad in terms of download. You're seeing all sorts of different images at this point. But I guess I'll finish up showing you the most recent thing that I did. And that is something called Indicted 2023. Which goes back to the stuff with Trump. This concentrates on the Trump and the people that are currently indicted in the Georgia prosecution. You know, the one where they are prosecuting Trump and many other people, mainly lawyers, for trying to overthrow the election. Basically, they're prosecuting him for an attempted coup, a failed attempted coup. And so this is a press release that isn't a press release. And this is a mixture of Trump and Giuliani and Mussolini. All of the images in this are clickable. So I describe this as a wicked synthesis, synthesis, because of course we're dealing with, anytime you're dealing with synthesis and Donald Trump, it's got to be spelled this way, doesn't it? A wicked synthesis of images of the recently indicted with Trump, Mussolini, and Hitler. So there's some comments by people. And then, text about it along with different images. So this is from Sidney Trump. Sidney Powell is one of the lawyers that, one of those crazy lawyers who said all sorts of crazy things. And so this is a mixture of her and Trump. Yeah, and just her and Trump. There's no other characters involved here. So you can tell more who's being mashed. And so there's that one. And then this project, there's others. Sidney Powell and Trump. Well, this is from Il Douche, a mixture of Donald Trump and Benito Mussolini, but when this is Don Twitler, which is a mix of Trump and Hitler. And then, like say, Jenna Ellis. Jenna Ellis is another of his crazed lawyers. And so this is just Jenna Ellis and Trump. But the idea, of course, of these was to try to get at something going on, like try to get at some sort of character, some sort of underlying character of what's going on, some sort of evil of what's going on here, because I think it really is evil. I think they're really scary. People say that the images are scary, but what's scarier is Trump and what he's doing. He's scary. So anyway, that's the most recent work that I've done with Aleph Null, and it's pretty close to an hour, so I will stop now. And
Brilliant. Great.
thanks,
Thank you
Karina.
so much. Yeah, really cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up to people who are in the audience first. If they want to either come up, like, turn on your microphone and ask a question of Jim, which I think would be more interesting for everyone. But if you're a bit shy, typing it into the chat would be fine as well. Do we have any immediate questions? Silence.
Hi, Jim. Can you hear me?
I
Yes.
can.
It's Tony. I'm wondering.
Oh, hey, Tony.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why it's called Aleph Null. Why Aleph? Why Null?
Right. Well, Aleph Null is a term used by the mathematician Georg Cantor to denote the first level of infinity. He did some fascinating work. He actually proved some things worth knowing about infinity, which is like, what? And he did it in the most beautiful manner possible. I mean, I've been a fan of his work. I think it's utterly transcendent. I think it's, you know, some of the most beautiful mathematics I studied as an undergraduate, and I've been an admirer of his work since then. And so it's a kind of a homage to his, or a touch of the cap to his work, and so that's the reason why.
I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm on the website now. I'm going to have a little play myself. But what is your relationship as an artist with the piece of software you've created? Is it a vehicle which allows you to create Jim Andrews artworks and other people to create images in your style? Or maybe do you see the software as a key part of your practice? Is it almost like the artwork itself, an artwork itself?
Right. Well, yeah, I guess I do see the software as a kind of an artwork in itself. Yeah. As a tool, it hasn't been adopted as widely as, say, you know, Dolly, Mid-Journey, or any of these tools that are AI. I'm not sure that mine is really AI in the sense that you know, people say it's got to learn before it's AI, blah blah blah. And other people say, oh, it's just got to appear intelligent, and then it's AI. But as a tool, Aleph Null is, well, I didn't really make it for other people to make. I made it for me to make art. I made it as a way for me to explore generative art online, and so it's always been, you know, just something for me, but it is something that other people can use. And so does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you've got sort of two extremes, maybe, artists who make software. You've got the Harold Cohen end, where he created a piece of software that ultimately became so closely bound with his practice that himself and Aaron are the artists working together. The software is an artwork, but the software creates his artwork. And then you've got the other extreme where somebody writes a piece of software and they say, here you go, it can create an almost infinite world of images or pieces of work, and whatever you create, it's one of my images, but you've created it. Yours feels like it sort of sits in the middle, really. It's it's something that you do allow other people to use. When they create images, do you feel that you're a collaborator in their images or in their work?
Well, one thing I forgot to mention is with Aleph Null 3.0, one of the features is you can import your own images into the brushes. So rather than having the default images that are my images or somebody else's images, because in Aleph Null 3.0 there are 19 invited artists and their images are brushes. So you can use your own images instead. Well, one is always surprised, or when it's good, one is surprised by what other people do with your software. I mean, at the best, you say, I had no idea you could do that. That's the best, because you've owned it. You've stolen it, you've owned it. Great. That's what I like to see.
Great.
And sometimes people they'll make some images with Aleph Null, and then they'll take those and do things with them in other software. And obviously that's a way to make them more their own. And I see what I've done as collaboration with various people, Bill Bissett, Jim Leftwich, etc. But do people see what they're doing with my stuff as collaboration? Well, I guess that's kind of up to them as to how they see it, rather than me.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, great.
Nice.
Jeff.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for the talk. It's very
Hey,
good.
Jeff.
Good to
Thank
see
you.
you. We've been emailing a bit.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, great. I've got a question about what you're producing with the tool is a thing to create text and visual non-linear narrative. And so you get the abstract nature of it, you get the collage nature. Now, recently you've been doing the Trump images, which of course are maybe using the same tool, but it's a completely different aim, which is a political, political protest. Now, did you find that you felt inspired to do something because of Trump? Because it's like that seems to be at the end of this long period of producing abstract art. You've gone into like an agitprop maybe, or political position that you're stating and publishing.
Well, I was interested too. Actually, doing the Trump stuff goes back to at least or at latest 2018, maybe before that. So I've been producing Trumpy images periodically since 2018.
That sounds quite horrible.
Yeah. But the brush that I use for that is a lot like the brush that I've used for some of the other stuff that you'd seen, in that the brush strokes are circles. So they're drawing circles, variably opaque circles, so that they tend to be fully opaque at the center, and then they become less opaque as you go out towards the edge of the circle. And so they're very similar sort of.
But did you think that Trump? I mean, I'm talking about not the technology as such now, but do you think Trump galvanized people to, artists in particular, to kind of unite against this monster? Because people seem to be more politically engaged now than they were. I mean, it wasn't particularly fashionable to be politically engaged, whereas in, say, the 60s and the 70s it was, and there were lots of art movements that have kind of disappeared, like protest performance art, agitprop, all these things are not really around now like they were then. So perhaps there is this thing happening. Have you found that with other artists over in America?
Well, I mean, my own motivations. What can I do to protest?
Well, yeah, sure.
this fascist, this would-be dictator.
Hmm.
I mean, he's a fascist would-be dictator.
Hmm.
He's like a Batman-esque villain. He's something out of a comic book. So, you know, what can I do? Well, I don't know, generative art in service of protest of this guy
Yeah, sure, which is very unusual. I mean, I do some,
worth doing.
yeah, I've done generative art, and it's a very abstract and divorced from reality sort of area, really, even though many people do it now. If you look at art blocks, for instance, or any of these big platforms, it could be anywhere or any time. You wouldn't really know.
Well, you know, some of the images that I posted to some Facebook groups devoted to generative, often abstract art, I was kind of surprised because, you know, very polarized, and a lot of Trumpies
Mm,
were just, you know,
sure.
they didn't like it at all. Huh?
Mhm.
You don't like it? Good. But anyway, yes, generative art is often very abstract. But one of the things that Aleph Null does is introduce what I like to think of as an interesting representational dimension
Mhm.
to generative art in its graphic synthesis. And of course, I should also say now that things like Midjourney, DALL-E are prevalent. The sort of synthesis that I'm describing in Aleph Null, well, the relationship I thought of was like, you know, the synthesis in Aleph Null is to collage.
Mhm.
What you know, like Midjourney is to my work. Like,
Yeah, sure.
the synthesis in Midjourney is much more sophisticated and different
Mhm.
than the sort of synthesis that I'm doing. But yeah.
Okay.
Great. So I have a question. Like I said at the beginning, I wanted to know how you feel your work has evolved since you've started way back in the 90s or earlier, perhaps. Because I remember seeing some of those early Flash works that were very much more, well, yeah, they're of their time, I suppose. But how do you see that journey for you from then till now?
Right. Well, it was director that I was using then. I did very little Flash work, but well, I mean, it's a long journey. That was back in the 90s, so more than 25 years. But when the world has changed a lot, of course. I mean, back then, net art was a really happening thing. These days, I'm not sure how you describe the situation of net art, but you know, as somebody producing work with computers and code, I guess it's been a matter of getting a better feel for, like, say, color. Uh, I've really tried to learn about color and visual art, and and getting a better sort of just artistic feel for what you can do with code, and staying on top of that, and getting it and reading about the history of it. I mean, reading about the history of computer art is very interesting. So I'm very happy to be involved with the Computer Art Society, because that is really an important dimension of what the Computer Art Society does. It's is the history of it. Getting a better sense of computer art historically has been a big part of it. And that's ongoing. Certainly not an expert in computer art, but lots to learn. And and I guess also as one grows older, it's more humility about it, because where is my work in the scheme of things? Well, it's got a very small part in the scheme of things, but continuing all the same, So,
Nice. Yeah, I just saw the new version of the digital art, I think the 4th volume or 4th edition by Christian Paul, and it's interesting to look at that, having lived through it through the last, well, I'm not as senior as some of the people in this group, of course, but just seeing how things have evolved and changed the way she's documented it, and she started, I think, more, or I mean, she gives a really great overview of from the 60s onward, but I think her biggest focus has been since she was involved in the 90s and the onset of the net art movement. And it's very interesting to see the shifts and changes in who she thinks is relevant. And I recommend it to everyone. But it feels like not only Computer Art Society, but around the world, there are more and more efforts to try to archive computer art, net art, all the digital work that's come since. And it's a daunting task, and how to cross or overlap those different histories and archives, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge, because they're all coming from different perspectives. So yeah, I just was curious, because I think, as you said, as you get older, you get more humility, but you also reflect on the things that you've done and where you've come from. And even though it feels like it was just yesterday, huge things have changed and developed. So are there any other thoughts or questions that people have that they want to ask Jim before we wrap up?
Just wanted to check one thing. What I'll do on the Computer Art Society website is, when the video is processed, I'll include a link to your slides and to the latest version of the code. So if people want to go and have a play, I'll put the link in there. Is it okay if I download your slides and put them in out on our website in a folder?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're meant to. If you can put a link to the PDF in the below the YouTube video, or however that works, hopefully that will be a fun thing for people.
There's a couple more questions. I think Paul had a question, and then Jeff.
Thank you. Jim, hello, and thank you for the talk.
Nice to meet you, Paul.
Nice to meet you too. Yeah, I'm really grateful to finally, I'm so happy when I saw that you were coming up. I was like, oh, this is perfect. I've been wanting to be able to get a chance to hear you in your own words talk about this work that I've been seeing for a long time.
Well, I really enjoyed your book on director, as it said.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's kind of a while ago, but it's nice to know when people are like, oh yeah, that thing. It's like there's a few things you said. This idea of existing in a no man's land, I think, really resonates with me, about what it means to be between many worlds simultaneously, and to kind of keep finding oneself there, but also to keep sort of forging ways to connect anyway, in spite of this no man's land that we so that really spoke to me. You also talked a bit, I think you had said, and because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you had said, like, one of the purposes I got was that there's this notion of creating an alternative signal, and like this sort of delicacy and nuance to not going so far that you create mush, I think was your words, like not wanting to, and so it was like kind of riding this sort of tension, and that really appealed to me. you then started to talk a bit about instruments and this instrumentation kind of language, and I love that. So my question, because I don't love to be the person who just rambles, but like my question really is just, I'm kind of curious about that language where it's, is it genuine? If it sounds like it's genuine and true that it's an instrument to you, I want to make sure I'm hearing that right. And if it is, then I'm kind of curious, like what other instruments do you see your work in dialogue with, or does it really just feel like a no man's land? Like I'm just kind of curious about that space.
Well, the keyboard control, I've tried to make the keyboard control of Aleph Null pretty good, so that you can play it with the keyboard or the mouse. Of course, you know, if it's on the net, that's usually all you got. It's the keyboard or the mouse. Although these days it isn't too hard to, like, for instance, I did some work with a guy named Steve DePaula, who teaches at SFU, and he wanted me to modify some of my software to work with the Leap Motion device. So these days it isn't too hard to hook up browser stuff to, you know, Leap Motion or other devices. That's kind of an improvement. I mean, back in the NetArt days, it's like mouse and keyboard, that's it. But these days you can hook it up to all sorts of different things. You know, mainly what I work with is the keyboard and the mouse. So in terms of, in relation to other things, well, the keyboard, the musical keyboard is the main one. But Aleph Null is an instrument not of audio stuff, but of sound stuff. So visual music, well, there's software, there's a lot of VJ software these days. And so to some extent it's in relation to VJ software as well. Those are the main ones that come to mind to me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It helps me kind of situate how you're imagining it and the types of things you're, you know, because like to me, I'm like, oh, you know, IP, Sandine processor, like, you know, go in these directions, but it feels very false for me to like make connections that, you know, you might say, no, that's, yes, I know those are things that are there, but that doesn't mean that just because there's this outcome similarity, there might not be a conceptual or emotional or expressive similarity that just might reside in bubbles that are nearby that seem to have visual attractors, but they don't actually touch. And I think that those subtleties are always curious to me. So it's great to know that it's this VJ kind of world is what kind of resonates for you.
Yeah, I did back around 2003, 2005. I worked for a musician, for a digital musician, and he employed me to create director stuff that you know, he could hook up to his MIDI keyboard, and so it would respond to his MIDI keyboard visually, and they were also working on another system. You know, you'd walk around a room with a thing that was detected by different cameras throughout the room, and so you have the position of the person, so you're getting the position of the person real time and responding visually with sound to that. So some relation with the VJ world that way. I was looking at VJ packages at that point pretty intensely. So well, what can I do that isn't done with those?
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Great.
And
Jeff.
thanks for your book.
Thank you.
And the art I've seen through the years online. Yeah,
Very
fantastic.
interesting question. Okay, just a quick one, which is a bit more general, but related to what you just said, Paul. One thing with AI generated, you mentioned Midjourney and Night Cafe and all these places. One of the issues, or if it is an issue even, is overproduction, in that you can create unlimited variety of images. Now, it's a similar thing that happens with Aleph Null, where there's an unlimited range of things you can produce with it, more or less, even though the brushes are set. You can still layer them and color them and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if people have, maybe not just you, Jim, but people have comments on this issue in computer art now, which is overproduction. You can, with a generative art system, you produce lots of things that are similar. But with these more generalized systems, you produce lots of things, like a huge number of things that are different, and it can just go on and on. Now, is that a problem for an artist, or is that just part of the new process that we're dealing with, which is a kind of democratization of art down to the level of there's just loads of it everywhere? Has anybody got any comments on that?
Well, I guess my feeling about that is that you know, the images that I've shown you of what I've made, I could be wrong. I don't think those look like what I'm seeing from you know, Midjourney, Dolly, or any of the other programs for that matter. So that you know, I like to think that what I'm doing is a little bit different than
Yeah, it's not the same. How it's made is not the same, and what comes out is not the same.
right.
I'm just wondering if
Yeah.
this thing of overproduction, because with non-linear narrative, you get the same effect. And I mean, I used to do this back in the 2000 period. I did some work at Middlesex University on all this non-linear area. And the thing about hypertext fiction was always that because it's got no narrative, you can have you know, many endings. And this idea of everything multiplying out more and more leaves a sort of narrative gap in the middle of it. And so, you know, and I think that can work with visuals because people receive visual image differently from text, obviously because of semantics. But it's just interesting that your work is definitely in that area that's really interesting from a text and image point of view. Just like I mentioned Midjourney because you'd mentioned them, and AI is, you know, you're not quite really doing AI, but it's a creation tool. It's you know, when the user can adapt a lot.
Let a thousand flowers bloom is, I mean,
Yeah.
I think my own part of the evolution, part of the change for me over time is being from a little more testosterone probably as well, defensive, whatever, to let a thousand flowers bloom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
I can't stop any of that stuff. I don't really want to stop it. And is it going to run me over? Well, it hasn't run me over yet. So.
Sure. Are you finding more people are interested now with the increase in interest in computer art? Because it has had an uptick in the last few years, definitely, I think. Do you find you know, younger people maybe contacting you about it?
Well, I do get some interesting younger people contacting me. Like I had a guy from Nigeria contact me.
Well, we all have that.
He sent. Well, this is a little different. Now, this guy did actually. He was actually interested in digital art and digital poetry, and had produced his own digital poems. And you know,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, great, excellent.
And also somebody from Bangladesh contacted me who wrote her master's degree on my stuff. And so yeah, I don't have a mass audience and probably never will have a mass audience, but being out on the internet, it's there for those souls for whom it's important to have access to this sort of stuff. Have I perceived any sort of increase? Well, no, I think it's been more of a decrease in my case, but Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Great. I think that's probably a good place to put a line under it. This was a really fascinating talk, and not that the other ones weren't as well, but
Hey,
this was
Angela.
really, really great. And I think you got a lot of messages in the chat saying how much people loved your work. So this was really great. And thank you so much for joining us, Jim.